Thanks very much, Ben. It's been said that one of the disadvantages of Zoom is that it's not easy to have informal chit chat and the sidebar conversations, but I think we're demonstrating that's a constraint that can be overcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this important conversation this afternoon. We're living in a very interesting time, but a time of interesting anniversaries. And in the forest of anniversaries, it might be possible to lose sight of the fact that we're still celebrating the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the School of Ecumenics. And this series of webinars was devised with a view to addressing issues which would be faithful to the founding vision of Michael Hurley for the school, and which would be an opportunity to connect the scholarship which is continuing within the school, within Trinity, and the tradition of civic engagement and partnership, which ISE Trust hopes to continue to foster. So we've had some very interesting conversations, very appropriate ones for our times. And this evening, I think, is particularly significant and has happily been, will benefit from the participation of a very distinguished panel of speakers, and we're very grateful to them for agreeing to participate. Our thanks too to Jin for his indefatigable organization of this series and for enabling all of us to come together virtually. So that's, I think, enough by way of preliminaries, and I'm delighted to hand over to David to chair the panel and get us underway.
Thanks very much, Dermot, and hello to everyone. It's great to see you, and it's great to be using this sort of fun Zoom format where you can scroll through and see who else is here, unlike the boring one where you don't really know who else is around. So anyway, it's great to see you, and this is a terrific topic. It's an intriguing topic. I think the whole idea of lessons and learning in peace processes is endlessly fascinating. I think peace and reconciliation are basically a learning process. You know, we learn, we have one understanding, and then we learn, we get to another understanding, and that's how things progress. We know that Northern Ireland has been seen as a place for other countries to learn from in terms of peace processes. But I think also fascinating is this whole idea of a peace process learning its own lessons from its own past, because we know that lots of peace processes actually fail repeatedly until they eventually have a breakthrough, and again that suggests a learning process. I don't need to remind anyone of the kind of juncture we're in here in Northern Ireland with Brexit, the protocol, the failure to deal with the past, potential constitutional change, and so on and so on. So I think it's always a good time to think about this topic, but this is definitely an apt occasion to sort of look back and also look forward. So to tackle this, Jin has assembled a crack team of experts with amazing experience from different sectors of society, from academia and to civic organizations. So I have the pleasure of introducing them. As Jin says, it's going to be in 2 rounds. So each speaker is going to do a short talk for 5 or 7 minutes, and then we'll go through the 2 rounds and then have questions. And I'll introduce everyone on this first round. So first up is Professor Katy Hayward. Katy is Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University in Belfast. Katy will be well known to many people because she's been at the forefront of both studying Brexit, but also explaining it to the rest of us, to ordinary people and to policymakers, and really informed the discourse and policy around what's been going on. She's a fellow of the UK in a Changing Europe think tank, fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, an Eisenhower fellow, and a fellow of the Mitchell Institute here at Queen's University here in Belfast. That suggested I was in the institute, but which I'm not. Anyway, and of course, Katy is the author of many publications on Brexit, on Northern Ireland, on peace and conflict, and many other things. So it's great to have you here with us, Katy. So I'll hand over you to you now.
Thank you very much, David, and good evening, everybody. First of all, congratulations to the Irish School of Ecumenics on over 50 years now. The ISC is a model of the civicness that is necessary to sustain peace, in that you don't just think about peace and you don't just research it, but you also enact it by connecting people together, by living it, by doing it, and most importantly, perhaps by teaching it as well. And not just to students, but to wider society. So it's wonderful to see you at 50 years. It's a great honor to be on such a panel and with people I enormously respect, who have a wealth of expertise and experience in relation to peace making and building that I most certainly do not have. And so in order not to embarrass myself too much, I'm going to stick to my area of expertise, which is, as David mentioned, Brexit. And of course, I'm very conscious of the fact that 50 years ago, the UK and Ireland were on the cusp of joining the European Economic Community. And we couldn't have imagined its significance, as it turned out, for the peace process on the island of Ireland, and importantly, of course, between Britain and Ireland more broadly. EEC membership and then EU membership transformed the intergovernmental relationship, but it also transformed relationships and connections between officials, of course, across wider society, shaping the context for normalizing cooperation and collaboration across borders, east-west and north-south. And it also, of course, entailed enormous changes fundamental to building the peace, such as the preservation and recognition of the importance of human rights, such as in the Charter for Fundamental Rights. Even when Northern Ireland was still in the European Union, even when Brexit wasn't a prospect, there was such a long way yet to go in relation to the peace process. And anybody trying to take lessons from the peace process in Northern Ireland, even a few years ago, would have been conscious of that fact. Post-Brexit, we've experienced a huge shock, I think, across generations. As David mentioned, there is the sense of change and transformation in relation to Brexit and the protocol too, that was meant to mitigate its effects here. What we are seeing now, perhaps, is new depths to old divisions, as well as new divisions of sorts. So to take lessons for the here and now, from the here and now where we are, thinking broadly, from the process of Brexit, we see that change can happen on a grand scale and very rapidly too. And even though the referendum was over 5 years ago now, the pace of change and the significance of that change is still, I think, hard to contemplate, especially as we know it's going to evolve and broaden in its impact. And it also, therefore, tells us that the context for change, for peace, can change very rapidly. Even those who did think through the ramifications of Brexit for the peace process couldn't have anticipated the solid state of democracy and elements that sustain democracy in the UK. So in the new context, we have the UK and Ireland on different trajectories. There are very acute tensions in the British-Irish relationship. There's a rise in antagonistic language and sentiment at the highest levels and then on the ground. And there are new severe strains in power sharing within Northern Ireland. Very evident on a day-to-day basis now. Jin asked us to think about challenges and opportunities, and I'm just going to outline them in relation to 3 areas of importance. And again, these are broadly, very broad realms of change and significance, but worth thinking about, I thought. The first area I would suggest is important to take lessons now, to take heed of vis-a-vis challenges and opportunities, is the public sphere of social media. So I think there are new challenges in relation to its importance as a public sphere. The challenges relate to the fact it's highly unregulated. It's designed to get a response. We know from when we watch programs about it on Netflix and when we read up on it, that is deliberately intended to be provocative. And of course, there's the creation of echo chambers. There's many challenges in the public sphere of social media, but there are also opportunities as well in it. There are new forms of connection. If we wish, we could hear people whom we've never heard from before, and we can get a better understanding of people from different perspectives. It's an opportunity for sharing information. It's an opportunity for mobilizing people and creating new sense of communities and connectivity. And there's an immediacy to it and a responsiveness to it that brings all sorts of opportunities, I think, politically and publicly, and therefore for good. The second area of change is the reworking of Northern Ireland's relationship with Britain and with Ireland. So the challenges in this, fundamentally, it's destabilizing. Northern Ireland's relationship with Britain is changed now. Its relationship with the South is changed, and we know that this will evolve and bring new challenges there. There's a risk to important areas of policy, for example, in environmental protection. There's uncertainty in relation to that. And also in the political sphere, there's a retreat to the basics, to a sort of a reductivist sense of what Northern Ireland's connection should be, north, south, east, west. But there's opportunities there too now. If we want to cooperate across borders, if policymakers want to do that, east, west, north, south, they have to make that choice almost. There has to be a will to connect, because it's more difficult than it was when Northern Ireland was in the EU. There's also opportunities for improving governance of Northern Ireland and across these islands, new opportunities for enhancing the institutions. And then the third area is in relation to the expectation, anticipation of a shared island. This conversation is growing. The Irish government is involved in enabling lots of conversations around it. And from public opinion polling, we know that increasingly people think that these are conversations that should be had. And some people increasingly think it's going to, a United Ireland is going to happen. So in relation to that particular aspect, there are obvious challenges. There are fears that this invokes for unionists, and there's also the risks of a sense of exclusion of Britishness and other identities on the island of Ireland. And again, there's a reductivist sense of what the future should look like, what a United Ireland means. In relation to these wider discussions, there are other opportunities as well, of course. There's an opportunity for genuine discussion of policy priorities. What sort of society do we want to see, whether it remains Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, or whether that changes? There's opportunities of recognizing the diversity that exists on the island of Ireland in traditions and identities, and enhancing those, recognizing their richness. And there's also an opportunity for holding leaders to account in the roles that they will play in this new space for conversations to be had. Thank you.
Super, thanks, Katie. That was a very succinct and incisive contribution. I look forward to all the speakers solving all these huge problems in the second round that they set up for themselves. But I think the point about social media is particularly interesting. Some people comment, how would the peace process have gone back in the 90s if we'd had social media, which is a fascinating question. But anyway, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to our second speaker, which is the Reverend Dr. Alex Wimberly. Alex is the leader of the Corrymeela Community, which will not be a stranger to this audience, I don't think. Alex is originally from the United States. He's been a Presbyterian minister here in Belfast. He has a PhD in history, which focuses on reconciliation in American Presbyterianism from the University of Notre Dame. And he's had various roles in Corrymeela, which is, of course, Northern Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation organization. And he's been leader of Corrymeela since 2019. So over to you now, Alex. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, David. And good afternoon. It is a delight to be with all of you, and an honor to be a part of this conversation, particularly with this group of panelists assembled. So I am very honored to be here. I'm glad to be representing the Corrymeela Community, this peace and reconciliation organization that for over 55 years has been working to help people on this island and these islands live well together. That work includes intimate involvement with the stitching together of communities that helped make the Irish peace process possible. And it includes the ongoing work of reconciliation that often occurs at the ground level and behind the scenes. So I'm privileged to help lead a community whose life and history is tied up with the relationships that have made the peace possible. However, as David was sort of, making clear, and my accent makes even more clear, I am a fish out of water here, more of an observer than anything else. And I can offer not a front row perspective or personal experience from decades past, but rather an outsider's point of view on the current landscape. I hope I can bring an informed, but nonetheless foreign eye to the opportunities and challenges that lie before us as we look at the lessons of the Irish peace process. Now, it won't surprise you that as an American, I would love to take as much credit as possible for whatever stability and pressure the United States provided to allow conversations in Northern Ireland and between Dublin and Westminster to take place. But I recognize, it doesn't take long to recognize, that the beauty, novelty, and success of the Irish peace process lie with those on these islands who did pretty remarkable things, couching the peace process in terms of people rather than territory, in concepts such as the parity of esteem and the reality of plural identities, concepts made workable only within the context of a European Union and therefore ill prepared for the advent of Brexit. I also recognize that the elegance of the power sharing agreement soon gave way to the incentives for power hoarding, power grabbing that plague a society that has peace, but not yet reconciled relationships, and therefore an exacerbated tribalism or polarization. Those observations will not add much to our discussion. I'm sure they're what a lot of folks can bring into this room, nor will my take on them offer much light because I am more ignorant than you know. But as an outsider who has spent more of the past much of the past two decades in Northern Ireland, and as someone who now lives within a community committed to the work of peace and reconciliation on this island, I think my contribution this evening is best focused on what I see as an opportunity to engage in communal practices of healing and the challenge of building relationships of trust. And in this regard, I have benefited greatly from the work done by my colleagues at Corrymeela, particularly Shona Bell and Duncan Morrow, and the report Moving from Violence to Peace, produced by an international working group convened by Corrymeela and the Mershon Center at the Ohio State University. So the opportunity to engage in communal practices of healing. It strikes me as an outsider that there are few rituals or practices in place to help those affected by the conflict in and about Northern Ireland to process the collective grief and trauma from decades of violence and centuries of division. Nor is there a shared opportunity to mark the ongoing success of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. We can point to examples of ritual and practice from other areas, rituals of acknowledgement for communities that include practices for the reintegration of ex-prisoners, for instance, practices that seem conspicuously absent from the Irish context. Commissions for truth and reconciliation that led to robust restorative practices. We can think of the 100 days of mourning built into the calendar in Rwanda to remember the Tutsi genocide. Studies from Rwanda on ex-prisoners' rehabilitation, that is, the acknowledgement of their humanity and their reintegration, feature moments of grace as survivors and perpetrators can manage to share a meal together. Forced reconciliation from the top down is never a winner and not what I would suggest, but these studies from Rwanda suggest that more than 80% of formerly imprisoned genocide combatants feel reintegrated into their community with the help of restorative practices that have been put into place. I'm also interested in the decision made just this last week, I think, closer to home, of naming St. Bridget's Day a national holiday in the Republic to bring attention to healing and healers in the context of COVID. A lovely idea of some sort of communal practice, communal recognition of the healing that needs to take place. Such practices are never merely ornamental or politically expedient. They are healing. Without ways to process the grief and trauma of the past, the hurt absorbed into the body politic threatens to reemerge in more sinister ways. This conflict affected not just the 3,500 dead and their families. There is not a street nor acre of inhabited land in this province that does not hold a memory that can still wound individuals and threaten the future of peace. There is not a conversation that entertains honesty, that doesn't also risk painful memories. This is as widespread a trauma as can be imagined, and therefore lends itself to a widespread collective engagement with our shared experience. The people of Northern Ireland, of Ireland and Britain would benefit from more rituals and practices that provide the space and security to address the suffering that violence has brought to this land. We are indebted to organizations like Healing Through Remembering for recognizing this necessary component for a lasting peace, and to several independent initiatives that do extraordinary service to society, often competing for funding from the same limited sources. Projects such as the Courage to Lament service that Corrymeela had helped lead at Belfast Cathedral last June, as well as the planned Centre for Acknowledgement and Memory and the proposed Museum of the Troubles and Peace, may provide further opportunity for such work. The church leaders' statement on St. Patrick's Day last year offered a glimpse of the type of leadership that is needed to acknowledge the pain and failures of the past. And in the absence of a society-wide program commissioned by a shared government, concerted efforts through diverse partnerships such as these offer the best route forward. Now, it would never be the easiest invitation to accept a collective turn toward the pain of the past. It is not politically or emotionally attractive. Who wants a national holiday to feel awful? And yet a collective acknowledgement of human suffering and shared practices of healing would, I believe, be beneficial in preventing greater rupture in the future. Our trauma is not going away, and unless it is processed deliberately and collectively, it will manifest later in ways simply out of our control. When we turn in the second round of conversation to overcoming challenges, I will not surprise you. I will suggest that the greatest challenge with introducing such rituals and practices for lament and healing is overcoming our lack of trust in each other. There is fear in our post-peace but not yet reconciled society that such practices for healing will become just another forum for arguing over winners and losers, of who is a more legitimate victim, of who is holding on to power illegitimately, who is grabbing power illegitimately. Nevertheless, there is hope that we can overcome these challenges, and I look forward to hearing from the other panelists as to lessons they have for us to consider. I'm already in debt to Katy, so thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Huge issues raised there about trust and restorative justice and ritualizing peace, because we still live among so many symbols of conflict, don't we? But we've struggled to find new ways to visualize and represent and sort of experience our new situation. So brilliant. Okay, so our third speaker is Alan Waite. Alan Waite is a senior manager of the RCITY Youth Project, a cross-community youth project in North Belfast. He started this when he was at the Hammer Youth Club alongside Thomas Turley of the Ardoyne Youth Club. And since then, the project has gone from strength to strength. It includes numerous programs for young people, summer camps, and its Belfast to Blanco program, which takes young people from Belfast to South Africa to carry out a whole range of community initiatives. RCITY's work has been recognised as best practice by the Education Authority, the Executive Office, and the Belfast Policing and Community Safety Partnership. And I must say, I've had the pleasure of introducing Alan many times before, because the RCITY project is a good friend of our master's course here in Belfast. And he's hosted many of our students over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. So it's brilliant to have him here today, and happy to hand over to him now.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. A few of the speakers before, one mentioned they felt like a fish out of water, and the other one says, from an outsider looking in. I'm blown away to be asked to be on this panel. And like Kate mentioned, the fish out of water, I feel like a fish out of water when it comes to speaking with such academics and stuff like that. I've never seen myself speaking on panels like this before. For me, I'm just your typical run-of-the-mill youth worker in the middle of North Belfast doing what we do. So hopefully, you know, I can put across just sort of the work that we're involved in terms of in terms of peace building. I just want to say a massive thank you to Jen and the guys at ISE for the opportunity to speak, and congratulations on the 50 years of the School of Economics. It's amazing. And suppose just to start me off, I want to try and keep it current. I want to talk. When I talk, I want to talk from the ground, from the streets, of what's going on now, and some of those issues and challenges that we're facing on an ongoing basis, on a daily basis. You know, very sporadically, can creep up at any time. At this very minute, we're experiencing a lot of trouble around the interfaces between Shankill and Ardoyne over the last 3-4 weeks. And it's a test in time, because in these given times, youth workers are no longer youth workers of the past. We're seen as some sort of superheroes, politicians, police, you name it. We're given all these labels to try and solve every single issue that's going on. But, you know, I'm going to look back. We're now 23 years, coming up to 24 years past the Good Friday Agreement. And we always talk and we always hear about the legacy of the Troubles. And we're still dealing with a lot of them. But back then, areas like, Shankill here, Ardoyne Falls, areas of high deprivation, money and resources flooded in. They flooded in so much that, you know, we get mixed up in what to do with it. It was the birth of a lot of great organisations and great pieces of work, but it also diminished and had a disastrous effect on a lot of work. People who were strong, people who had a strong ethos and an understanding of where they were going, were often sidelined because of finance, because of money, and diluted the actual strength of their organisations. And therefore, as much as we gained a lot, we also lost a lot. One of the big things that we lost was the concept of volunteering, the concept of giving back to your community and doing good, because it was no longer, you know, there's a few quid for that, or we'll pay you to be volunteering. And then when the money dries up, there's no one wants to do that bit of volunteering, wants to do that wee bit of giving back. And we talk about, you know, we talk about the transgenerational process of what's being passed to our young people. We talk about the underachievement when it comes to education. We talk about the mental health and suicide rates. And for me, every one of those are legacies of the Troubles. They're implementations of what went on before. So young people nowadays, young people in North Belfast living in these areas, they're still facing a lot of challenges from the past, but then the new age challenges that come along with that. We talk about paramilitaries. We did a consultation on Shankill around 15-20 years ago. We asked young people what are the issues that they were facing, and the issues back then, paramilitaries were sitting number 2 on the list. Teenage pregnancy, I think, was number 1, and boredom and so on. We did the exact same process there just before COVID kicked in, and it was fascinating to see the differences in what had changed. The teenage pregnancy was way down the list. Paramilitaries were not near the top, but what replaced that was mental health issues, education, employment, and the things that young people now feel is important to them. So we're dealing with a multitude of issues which are all interconnected, or all have a knock-on effect on moving forward in these areas. You know, places like this are still very territorial. There's, you know, some of the young people that we're working with, they have this, you know, they see the peace lines, you can see the walls, but they also have those invisible walls and areas where you don't cross over. And again, that's things that's been passed through them. It's just the norm of growing up in communities here in North Belfast. With our project, you know, when we first started RCITY, for anybody who doesn't know RCITY, it stands for R slang for it's ours, belongs to the young people. And the city stands for communities integrating through youth, using young people as a tool to engage two communities together. When we first started it, when Thomas Sturdy from Ardoyne, he was a co-founder of the program, he said he'd love to get involved and do some sort of, you know, good religious program that was truly going to impact the lives of young people and participants, and also the wider community. And I'd said to him, Turles, if we're going to be doing a program, and you know, that old saying, if you always do what you've always done, you always get it. I said, let's change it up. Let's throw things on their head. Let's do something that's totally different from what's being done, and we'll see what the results give us. And I'll talk about some of those results, you know, in the next phase. But what we wanted to do, we wanted to really challenge young people. We wanted to challenge their families. We wanted to challenge the communities in which they lived. And through the last 8 to 9 years, we've been able to do that there. And we'll speak about some of the hurdles some of the challenges we go on and some of the opportunities, how to go for that. You know, be under no illusion, our areas are still very dominated by paramilitarism. There's still there's people in the community that's hell bent and moving forward, and that becomes a difficulty. Some of our young people are lost when it comes to the big political world. You know, they're looking for someone to take the lead, someone to show them, someone who they can trust in to deliver a brighter future. And at the minute, they're not finding it in some of those areas. So it's a very turbulent time for to be a young person growing up here in these areas. It's a difficult time, and there's so much challenges that they face. And hopefully we can look at, you know, dealing with some of those challenges as we move forward.
Thanks, Alan. Super.
No worries.
I feel like we've gone from the heights of Brexit and the sort of scale down to the kind of the intimate street level of where people's lives are happening. Amazing. So I'll move on now to our next speaker, who is Barbara Walsh. Barbara Walsh is chair of the Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation down in County Wicklow. Barbara has long been an advocate for non-violence and social justice in many roles. She's worked as a peace envoy and observer in Israel-Palestine. She's worked for the Combat Poverty Agency. She's worked in restorative justice. She's made an RTE radio series called Picking Up the Pieces on grassroots peace building in Ireland, and contributed to many debates and discussions in Ireland and overseas about peace and reconciliation. So it's terrific to have you here today with us, Barbara, and it's over to you. Thanks.
Oh, thanks very much, David, and hi to everybody. So I wanted to start maybe just this evening with a quote from Fergal Keane, the war correspondent for the BBC. And he said, he wrote from his book Wounds, which basically was looking at the impact of the civil war in North Kerry, where his people came from. And he said it was Ireland's greatest tragedy that people who loved the same country became such bitter enemies. And I suppose I've been chair of the board at Glencree for the past 7 years, and a bit like the 50th anniversaries that are here for ICE at the moment, Glencree is almost 50 years old as well. It was probably inspired initially by Corrymeela and about what went on in Corrymeela during that time by Ray Davey, who started it. And then it was picked up maybe by a lot of people who are attending this conference, this symposium this evening, who were maybe engaged or involved in it. They were people who came from different faiths at that time in 1974, when Glencree was set up as a response to the outbreak of violent conflict in the north of the island. And basically its genesis again came out of the Irish Civil War, because one of the main founders of Glencree during that time was a woman called Unu Higgins O'Malley, and her father was the Minister for Justice in the first government after partition, and he was assassinated in 1927. As she would say herself, what happened to her in a way influenced her entire life, and she felt really that her entire focus would be on the development of reconciliation, not just within Northern Ireland, but across this island. And I suppose in that time since Glencree, and has gone through many iterations and indeed many ups and downs, it has been really there to facilitate dialogue quietly, away from, if anybody's been down there, they know how quiet it can be and how far probably removed it is as well. Maybe not as much as it was now, but certainly then when people talk about brown water and no telephone lines, certainly no Twitter to worry about or anything like that, then it's changed a lot since then, I guess. So I suppose, what was it like for a peace centre devoted to reconciliation on this island, with a particular focus on our northern on the northern part of the island, and how engaged were people from the Republic of Ireland and the south of Ireland. And I'd have to say, not very much. So at some level, I think that a lot of us, myself included, I was born in Clare, lived out my life most of the time in the west of Ireland, and sometimes the conflict was something that we saw on television. So that engagement in the south, you know, has not been great. Now it has changed, and I suppose the signing of the Good Friday Agreement was really a key moment, really, in recognizing what the importance of relationships on the island itself, and that the expression of that really came from the fact that at that particular time it spanned a commitment from the US, from the UK government, and from the Irish government. But also, really what held that piece together was the myriad of people like Alan and others that spent their lives in some way or another working for peace in the middle of mayhem. That is something that none of us that lived, most of us that lived definitely well south of the border, did not experience during that time. So when I think today then of what is it when as Katie said, we are processing Brexit, the impact of Brexit, and now we have the Republic of Ireland, which is basically the border between the UK and the EU, right? And then the complexity that has thrown up, never mind the relationships that it has fractured, the fears that it and the uncertainty that it has risen again. And yet within all of that, people are extraordinarily innovative in actually, you know, circumventing a lot of that, as we see in the trade lines that are moving now and finding their ways around business and across continents and between Ireland and the UK again. I suppose the strain that exists within all of that is the fact that it is now a choice that one has to make. You have to jump through the bureaucratic hoops in many different places, and in some level that has also kind of added to the drama or the uncertainty around all of that. But nevertheless, we live with our closest neighbor. We have strong social, economic, cultural ties that have been there for as long as we have, and really we're not going anywhere. Nobody is going to tow either one of us off into the Atlantic or anywhere else. So at some level, our job in some way is to be able to maintain those relationships, to develop those relationships. And people mentioned trust already. That trust that structured as a result of what happened, that our job in some way is to develop, maintain, and knit that trust again. And that's no easy job. But also when we talk about a peace process, that's what it is. You know, there are people who in 1998 said, well, that's the end of the conflict. Never mind those of us that lived in the Republic. That's the end of it now. It'll be fine now. But in some way, I don't think we recognized that that really is just the beginning of a process, beginning of peace. And that's something that has to be cared for, promoted, worked for, and enabled between all of this. And when people talk about a shared island or the unification of Ireland in some way, I suppose at Glencree what we say is, it's not about the territory, it's about the relationships. And it's about a country that is changing before our very eyes. 13.5% of people who are living now south of the border were not born in this country. They have come from something like 150 different countries around the world. They're working in tech or they're working in hospitality. We're marrying each other, we're living with each other, we're being educated together, more by accident design, but that's all happening. That's all happening now. And I think within Northern Ireland, that's also happening, that there is the change is happening there. So we have a range of people who are choosing to make the island of Ireland kind of their home. And I suppose for me, the worrying thing, I was listening to, again, Alan talking about youngsters that are living in communities that are maybe, I don't even like to call them deprived, but that maybe have fewer resources than other places. And we have those too. We have those too, with the same issues, and the same things are happening. But for me, what I think when we talk about young people, I worry about the fact that you have a lot of young people in Northern Ireland who are being educated elsewhere and not choosing to come back and make Northern Ireland their home. So in some way, what are the implications of that for us and I'm not talking about Northern Ireland, I'm just saying the island of Ireland. What are the implications of that for us as people that are living on this island and a future generation? It won't affect me, I'll be dead, but for another generation that are coming on and generation after that. And I'm not quite sure if those young people see the same boundaries that we saw or had the same experiences that we had. Sometimes I feel they don't see them at all. And that at some level, they're copper fastened sometimes by politicians or political perspectives that come from whatever perspective within all of that. So I feel we just have to be really careful about that. I do not think they see the world as we saw it and we were taught to see it. And to me, that's a real opportunity. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Barbara. A great reminder of Glencree's contribution to the peace process, but also how the whole island is changing. And that role will still be there, of course. Great, and now it's time to introduce our final speaker of this round anyway, Geraldine Smith. Geraldine Smith is Adjunct Associate Professor in the School of Religion, Theology and Peace Studies in Trinity College Dublin. She's worked for decades in research and action on conflict transformation, ecumenical and interreligious reconciliation in Ireland and beyond. She was the director of the Irish School of Ecumenics twice, it says here, so you must have really enjoyed it, Geraldine, if you went back for a second go, and former chair of the INCOR advisory group at Ulster University. She's on the board of directors of Healing Through Remembering and has acted as a theological consultant to the World Council of Churches, and she's a member of the Dominican Order. So it's over to you now, Geraldine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks everybody. It's lovely to be here among such a wonderful group, many of whom I know or known about and experienced something of their contribution and willingness to cooperate across our different institutions, cities, places of work, different church or ideological traditions. So some of what I was going to say has been very eloquently said, so rather than go over it in the same way as I'd planned to, I'm going to pick up on some of the themes that were voiced already in terms of where we are now, and there's been talk of the intergenerational nature of the conflict and the peace process, and the sense of things recurring, the things that we had hoped had been worked through have to be reworked through, reimagined and rewrought in every generation. But I was prompted to look again at Brian Keenan's book, An Evil Cradling, and his, in the opening pages, his walk around a divided Belfast before he took off to another hotbed, though he didn't know it at the time, of violence arising in the context of identity politics and clashing cultures. And I think it still speaks to our condition where we are now. He says, there are those who cross the Jordan and seek out truth through a different experience from the one they are born to. Theirs is the greatest struggle. To move from one cultural ethos to another, as I did, and emerge embracing them both, demands more than any armed struggle. For here is the real conflict by which we move into maturity. Those who struggle through turbulent Jordan waters have gone beyond the glib definitions of politics and religion. The rest remain, standing on, firing guns at one another. I had had enough of gunfire, the rhetoric of hate and redundant ideologies. In preparing for this seminar, I kept coming up with the sense of déjà vu. And I'm not saying that out of a sense of pessimism or defeatism, but of a sense of realism and the challenge facing us to continue to analyze, to continue to engage, to continue to have conversations across our different cultures, traditions, perspectives of different kinds of experiences. Another aspect of these years that we're reflecting on is, of course, the wonderful variegated kinds of initiatives at community and civic level that paved the way towards the political agreements that have built upon them, very often without much recognition from the formal political sphere, and challenging us again to consider how civic society in its more progressive and imaginative and committed ways, as distinct from its regressive types, and we have to watch out for that in us all. I think, Alan, you were pointing to the fact that when there's funding and an interesting kind of set of challenges to be met, sometimes the end is lost, the larger horizon is lost. When you mentioned Uno Higgins O'Malley, Barbara, and the fact that out of the tragic experience of the loss of her father in a time of post-immediate civil war and the beginning after that to build the young democracy, how that generated something in her that was a compulsion and imperative to building peace, and not just in her own place. So the challenges that I am most aware of in terms of ones that I jotted down for myself that I'm finding resonance with yourselves was the one about dealing with the past. The areas of suffering and pain that have remained unresolved, unrecognized, and repeated formal attempts that have fallen flat on their face, going right back to the Eames Bradley report in the past, the Haas-O'Sullivan initiatives, the panel of parties, the reports that have been put before us without gaining agreement as to ways forward. But I'll come back to that in the second round of discussion, since it will come up with having been developed so powerfully by yourself, Alex. But it brings me back to the challenge of finding good ways of understanding the violent conflict in and about Northern Ireland, ways of analysing it, grappling with it, and listening to diverse perspectives on it, because it's a job that needs to be done over and over again. One of the research projects that built on the work of the Irish Interchurch Meeting, the Irish Council of Churches, one of the research projects that ISE developed in the 90s was that of moving beyond sectarianism. And I spare you PowerPoints, but some of you might be familiar with that, that pyramid diagram, which shows the ubiquity of sectarian division and the different levels, from ordinary decent citizens to leaders at church and social and community and political level. And then what were described as the paramilitary groups, combatants in the struggle or the war, and the psychotic killers, each level depending on the level below it for support, each level disowning the closed-mindedness or the violence or the atrocities of the level above it. But I think what has remained almost intractable beyond accepting the need to be in dialogue with everybody in the upward levels of the pyramid. I think we have not given enough attention to this dividing line down the middle, which Frank Wright, once a member of the Queen's academic community and of the Corrymeela community, he has analysed that in a way that is ever usable and enlightening in opening our eyes to how we are still living in the context of an ethnic frontier society, where everything, be it our politics, our religious persuasion, our culture, our music, our sport, our leisure, is construed and constellated around that division, so that all of those things, particularly in terms of politics and religion, sacralized politics and politicized religion, all of those are viewed in oppositional and antagonistic ways by those who situate themselves or who are relegated to, even in terms of the Good Friday Agreement and the consociational model that is enshrined there. It's been said by many before me, it is in some ways outlived its usefulness, that dimension of it, in that it's confining people to declare themselves on one side of the divide or other. So I think there's a challenge here to actually face up to what several of you have pointed to in terms of the challenge of building relationships. And doing that in making good the terrible deficits and in the need for prejudice reduction, to understand how we're all caught in binds of stereotyping others with whom we don't have conversations. I'm aware, Alan, when you were speaking about young people, I mean, many of my generation find it hard even to meet young people and have conversations with them outside our own families. And mine are, I'm caught between two worlds. My nieces and nephews are no longer young, and the grandnieces and nephews are in the adolescent phase of not really wanting good conversations with aged aunts, grand aunts. So that challenge of reconciliation and relationship is there, and there is a wealth, a reservoir, a wellspring of experience and resource from within the many groups, the hosts of people and associations and networks who have actually developed a body of learning, a body of experience, and of trust, showing that it can be done, and have nurtured hope. There are still new initiatives coming out of some of our organizations, not just among the panelists, but more widely in this audience. So the sense of beginning, today's Holocaust Memorial Day, I was looking at Hannah Arendt the Jewish secular philosopher, this morning. And I was thinking of her in relation to Uno Higgins O'Malley, who determined that our relationships are political and cultural and otherwise in divided societies and out of civil war contexts are not necessary to be premised on mortality and death. I think we have to come at it also from the other side, not only of preventing violence and of tackling the death dealing kind of structures and myths of violence as redemptive, but we've also to look at promoting and building. So she spoke about the fact that if we began to think about our life, particularly our political life, that it needs to break out of totalitarian or sectarian strictures, if we began with the concept of natality, of birth, of new beginnings, that it is always possible to make a new beginning. I think that we have so many individuals, so many organizations, and many of them in the last 10 years who would not have been talking to one another. There are people who have actually defied the odds. So I think I've probably used up my time. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Geraldine. Thanks so much for those wide-ranging insights, and more to pick up later. So we're at the end of our first round. We're a little bit behind time. So I'm going to ask all the speakers if they can err on the shorter side of the allotted time. That would be that will get you extra points, I suppose. And we'll try and get through, because we do want to have a discussion. And again, in the chat box, we won't be speaking out questions, but if you have a question, put it in the chat, and we'll try and make sense of that long column of words that appears on the right-hand side. So thanks very much. So Katy, if you're ready to go for the second round, it's over to you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It's been wonderful to learn from everyone in the panel. It's really rich. I'm just going to try and get those points by being succinct. And I just have 5 characteristics that I was thinking about in terms of trying to do things better, perhaps, and maybe picking up from where Geraldine finished there about new beginnings. And I'm speaking as an academic, and I'm conscious of my ISE colleagues. And I'm just wondering about what sort of reflections might be useful for us as academics, and then maybe more broadly into the wider community. So the first characteristic that I think would be good to have is that of reflexivity. We often talk about this in sociology, and by which we mean sort of self-reference, but I think we haven't done it properly. And I'm thinking particularly of my own work, in that there's too much that we assumed that proved to be ill-founded or very much shaped by our socialization, or by things that we naturally liked to see, and yet which were not necessarily always going to be remaining in place. And I'm going to mention that in a second. And I think reflexivity is important in terms of cause and effect. So recognizing that each of us does have an effect, and being conscious of our responsibilities in that regard. So that idea of being reflexive, I think, can be a really positive thing, especially in modes and times of transformation. The second characteristic that I think would be valuable now is the characteristic of humility. And I'm thinking particularly somebody as a UK citizen, but I think there's the fact that there's no such thing as an unimpeachable democracy. And we all need to be humble in liberal democracies, and being aware of that, I think. There's no such thing as human rights or as fundamental rights that are untouchable. There's no such thing as a rule of law that can't be trammeled in some ways. There are no such things as institutions that can't be eroded. And there's no such thing as irreversible progress. And I think recognizing that vulnerability is possibly a useful thing to do. And the humility comes in relation to the fact that many of us were kind of lackadaisical. Politics was becoming entertainment in the UK, and there's consequences to that. In Northern Ireland, we're used to politics being entertaining if we're truthful about it. That's what we have kind of allowed politics to be seen as primarily. And therefore we're not holding people, as I mentioned earlier, to account as we should. A third characteristic would be to have an alertness to our neighbour. And I don't just mean to our local neighbours and the communities in which we live and the communities around us and beside us. Also, we should have an alertness to what's going on at an international level, to kin states, if you like, because what can happen in a partner can have consequences to the heart of a peace process. And obviously I'm thinking of Brexit here, but also in terms of what's happening in the EU. And Ireland as an EU member state needs to have an alertness to its EU neighbours. What's happening in Hungary and Poland, for example, those are deeply alarming. And as a neighbour and as an EU member state, Ireland has a responsibility to challenge that. Because just as the blessings of good government can't be bound by state borders, so the rot of bad government can't be bound by borders as well. And I think we see that across the EU. The fourth characteristic that I would like to have is courage. We need to be wholly unforgiving of things that corrupt democracy. Because those things can expose wounds that can turn septic. So things that may seem small at a certain point can have longer term consequences for the health of the wider democracy. And the courage relates to the need to protect the freedom of speech and such things as academic integrity, which are precious and which are necessary and need to be used with wisdom, and they need to be protected, and that will take courage. Particularly, as I mentioned before, but not exclusively, but in the sphere of social media. And our politicians in particular and our community leaders are often asked to show courage in that regard, or challenged in speaking out. And then finally, and this really is very much related, I think, to what Geraldine was talking about with respect to the body of experience, learning and trust that she referred to. So the final characteristic I think we need to have is that of a collaborative spirit. So a commitment to truth and to the common good, being found hand in hand with others. As an academic, commitment to good research, to good quality evidence. But through finding that, we need collaboration with disparate partners and listening to those who would otherwise be unheard, which returns me back to that first point I made about reflexivity, in that it's too easy to ignore those things that don't fit in with our narratives or understandings of what makes for peace or what causes conflict indeed. And Alan's point around what young people are saying now around their concern around mental health, around employment, precarious employment, poverty, etc. These are the voices that we should be listening to now, because that's where peace is made or broken. Thank you.
Super. Thanks so much, Katie. Without further ado, over to you, Alex. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone. Again, so earlier I was basing my observation as an outsider on the work carried out through Corrymeela, that an opportunity was before us in an introduction of more communal practices that will help us process our grief, our trauma. That is, can we construct rituals, practices that will not glorify violence or enshrine heroes from our version of history, but instead create space to acknowledge the human suffering at the heart of our common story, and make clear that suffering is always a consequence of violence, justified or not. And as I hinted before, the challenge that comes with this opportunity, I think, is not only the hard sell of communal lament, who wants to face our darkness deliberately, who wants to move through pain to see if healing might be possible, but also, and I think more troubling, to echo what some folks have already said, the suspicion that such a communal, national, collective practice can only benefit one side or the other. Trust is low in our society. A recent Faith and Life survey indicated that only 5% of the Northern Ireland population trusts the UK government. I think 5% of the Northern Ireland population works for the UK government. So it's a troubling statistic, as is the fact that 75% of those surveyed feel their voice does not matter or is heard in society. So how can we trust that a collective practice that I would kind of suggest will include our story so that we can in turn hear other stories? How do we ensure that the rituals and practices of processing our collective grief will represent the people's experience and not a political agenda? Unfortunately, I think the best answer I can give to those questions will look like a Mobius strip. We earn trust by being trustworthy. Rituals and practices build trust and provide healing only when people are willing to take part in rituals and practices of healing. It's a bit chicken and egg, or a come and see invitation. And you either feel invited or you don't. You will know instinctively whether this is something you want to come and see. I promise I wasn't expecting to go into a sermon for this event, but as this is the Irish School of Ecumenics, a little retreat into the Gospel of John might not be totally inappropriate. And I'm reminded of the call of Nathaniel. I can send you to the Spirituality of Conflict website for a longer discourse on this in John 1, but Nathaniel is predisposed to distrust anything Jesus has to say because Jesus is from Nazareth, and can anything good come out of Nazareth? I mean, really. But in the end, Nathaniel is willing to come and see because he trusts Philip. His personal relationship with a friend lends him enough trust to move forward. There are similar footholds for us, I believe, in our context. The last 25 years have allowed us to build relationships across this island and these islands with people worthy of our trust. There are people we trust who trust others we might not. This past week, Corrymeela member Jenny Megan hosted a conversation between a Republican ex-prisoner and a former British soldier, a sort of event that has been duplicated, or this was a duplication of something that's happened many, many times with a lot of our organizations. But it brought together two men who have come to trust each other despite their divided past and because of a shared view that violence is never the answer. They also trust Jenny, the woman who hosted them that evening. Their individual stories led to a shared story, and their connections with different communities can help us create a path to a shared space. It seems to me that as a generation of ex-combatants age and perhaps mellow, there is an opportunity to collect stories and gather people again in practices of listening that do not try to answer the question of who was right, but that allow our shared stories to provide the space for the start of a shared future. It may be that 25 years after the formation of the Good Friday Agreement is exactly the right time to bring these stories together. Corrymeela has been a place of encounter and I can just say that for our part in bringing people together for storytelling and reflection for generations now, we would not have been able to do that unless we had built up the relationships of trust that I see, organizations like RCITY doing so well. I think that's probably the on-the-ground arena of real relationships that we need to remind ourselves are most precious. We have at Corrymeela absorbed vicariously into our tissues the trauma that victims and perpetrators have brought through our doors. And so we too benefit and will benefit from acknowledging and processing the compounding effect of that vicarious trauma. But it has been a privilege to be a part of conversations that our relationships have brought us into. And we have been able to see breakthroughs happen, healing take place, when people who are divided find the common ground to hear and to be heard. Through practices of hospitality and rituals of belonging, spaces of hearing and being heard come into reality. And these are not places to identify winners or losers, victors or victims, those on the ascendancy or those losing status, nor are they swamps for wallowing in self-pity. They are spaces of connection that allow us to address the common suffering that violence, from whatever source, has created. But they only happen when there is enough trust to get people in the door, when there is enough courage to build a community where trust can be earned. I do not know how to build up the necessary level of trust to assure people that the kind of practices of lament and healing I think are needed will be helpful. But I think the onus lies on those who have earned trust with different communities to join together to offer such practices. Only then will more people feel invited to come and see a space that is safe enough to address the collective human suffering that has yet to be fully acknowledged, to recognize the humanity of those who have yet to be integrated into our sense of community, and to hold each other within these common practices so that together we can find healing. Thank you very much for the chance to talk to you this evening, be a part of this.
Thanks so much, Alex. And now it's down to Alan. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Relationships has been a word that's been used many a times throughout this evening, and indeed, relationship is key. It's key not only just to youth work, but it's key to a lot of aspects of our life. One of the things I want to talk about when we're talking about the recommendations and overcoming the challenges that I spoke of before, I think it's important. Longevity is a massive part of moving forward. Tokenistically, there's been programs that's run where it's let's bring the two sides together for a wee weekend away. We'll buy them some hoodies and they'll do a couple of activities, and then we bring them back to Belfast. They don't see each other ever again. Longevity, I think, is key. If every one of us on this chat, in this webinar tonight, if we think about our best friends, for instance, your best friends isn't made up of someone who you spent one weekend with. Your best friends is made up of people where your families came together every weekend and you run about with your cousins, or someone you spent a long period of time through school, your football team, your GAA club. That's where proper friendships is made. There's longevity, and then relationships grow. And I think that's important. Here at RCITY, what we have done, we have developed a youth project that's took risks, that's turned the norm of good relations work upside down. And what we have done, we provided a space and an environment for young people to grow and nurture those relationships properly. And the end result of that is the amazing young people, the amazing changes that we have. We have young people who come onto the program 8-9 years ago are now living together. They've got families together, and some you can't get away from it when you're living and working in areas where we are. Their parents and their families were right at the heart of the conflict. But all of a sudden we have their sons and their daughters, going with the enemy as such, living with the enemy as such. And that's where real change begins to happen. So longevity is so important to what we do. I talked about the funding and the resources that come into communities. I think if organizations or people at the helm of them organizations can realize, be selective with your funding. Here at RCITY, we're not flooding with resources by no means, but what we are flooded with is a batch of young people who have been through a progression route into wanting to give back to their community. We've got them addicted. We've got them addicted to that helping others, going into the community and doing good. That feeling you get when you do nice for someone, it's amazing. It's the best feeling in the world. But if we can create opportunities for our young people to get that feeling, then it's replicated and it happens throughout. And that's what we're trying to provide, and that's what we're doing here up in Belfast. But if people at the helm of them organisations can only look at their funding and go, you know what, it's not for us, it'll dilute, and be selective of what you do. We in our city, we're not abundant with it. It's important to inspire young people. Give young people opportunities that's out of the norm for them. Growing up here in Belfast, if you were lucky to get a holiday many years ago, coming from the Shankill, you'd have went to Benidorm. The first thing you'd have looked for was a British pubs doing British food, and having all your neighbours from the Shankill across. You weren't getting there was no culture. All you're doing is lifting your own culture from here and bringing it into somewhere a wee bit warmer. So, creating experience, creating opportunities for young people to actually taste new cultures, see new cultures, touch new cultures is very, very important. That's where we have introduced a lot of our international context of the work that we do. We have great partnerships, and we're lucky to have super partners in terms of the likes of Jin and the G4P project in South Korea, where our young people over the last 2 years of COVID have been online, they've been working, they've been learning about each other's culture from someone at the opposite side of the world who are facing not so different circumstances of what we went through. we have the context of South Africa, where the young people, when they come through the progression route of our city, what they do is they use them skills, them leadership skills that they have gained, and they put them into action. 99.9% of our project and staff are ex-participants. I'm the only one in our program who's, who hasn't come through the program, right down to our admin assistant. They're gaining them skills, they're creating them experiences. Let's put them to use. And I think it's about having that non-tokenistic approach. Let's not just do something because it sounds good or it looks good. Be genuine in everything we do. One of the other things I want to speak about is the different styles of work, the partnerships. We talk about relationships. I'm going to use that throughout the next few minutes. Having relationships with some of the big universities. We've got a real good partnership with Queen's University. And for young people from this side of the town, where education is at all time low, they sometimes look at universities, like the likes of Queen's, and go, that's a big place, it's a massive university, which I'll never achieve. But what we had to do was we had to be creative of how we put in, how we educate our young people, how we were able to put accreditations throughout our program that breaks down that stigma of we can't achieve that. And at the minute we have, I would say we've had around 40, 50 young people at the minute that's going on till universities and are currently in the system. And what they're doing is they're breaking that mold. And by breaking that mold, they're becoming role models. They become role models for this community, where other young people are going, whoa, if Pierce can do that or if Alan can do that, you know what? It's achievable for me, I can do it. And having that knock-on effect. We work closely with all schools from primary to high school and until universities. And what that's really doing is it's really making young people see this is achievable. No longer they've been told you're not worthy, but they're no longer told you're antisocial or this. They're actually starting to step up to them. Our young people are absolutely amazing. They're so creative, they're so inspiring. They're full of energy. And sometimes it's hard for young people to have their voice heard. And we believe social media was mentioned earlier. And we believe, as much as social media has a lot of negative aspects to it, that also it's what young people are into. So let's use it to our gain. Young people, they're quicker to click on their phone and watch a video on something rather than read, 4 or 5 screens of words. So it's about being creative how we disseminate what we want young people to learn from. And I must say, sometimes I have to pinch myself when you see a young person achieve. It makes you so, you're filled with pride, where, we're blown away on a daily basis here at our city and a lot of the amazing work that's going on around the country. But I think we've still a lot to do in terms of, promoting that. The media is, it can sell negativity like that, and they want the negative stories. Our door rapped constantly during the recent troubles just before Christmas around the protocol and Alarnic Way and stuff like that, with Sky TV and BBC wanting all these negative stories. And we told them, no, if you want to report the good, positive stories that we're doing on a daily basis, year on year, by no means, yep, we'll do it. But if you just want to be negative story, don't come to us. So our young people, they go to the social media, they've did their own flyers, papers, they've posted everything to raise that profile. So young people are unbelievable. They're outstanding, and I think our future's in a safe hands. But we just need to pave the way and create more opportunities and connectivity across the wider scale. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Alan. Amazing. And next we'll move on to Barbara. Thanks very much, Barbara.
So a lot of what has been said already, I would absolutely endorse. Katy talked about the need for humility and the protection of democracy, and politics being seen as more than entertainment. And Alan talking about, the creation of the creation, like, how do we create a society that doesn't just replicate what has gone on in some way or another? So, and where is the inspiration for the creation of that freedom and liberation and the space that will enable people and young people to be able to follow that, to be able to make their own choices around education and travel and safety and intermarriage or whatever, So in some way, I think that all of us on this island need to create the conditions for that enable people to be able to move. So whether you're from North Belfast or you're from South Kerry, that at some level you're able to meet and you're able to engage and you're able to talk to people, you know. And I suppose what's remarkable is that when we talk about what really matters to all of us is safety, a place to call our own, a family, education, a job, prospects, opportunities. Those kind of things are all things that we have in common. I suppose the thing that I would just like to say as a last comment is there's two things. One, the legacy of violence. Glencree has spent a lot of his life, and still does, enabling conversations to happen between people who have hurt each other very badly. And that's dialogue is facilitated by somebody they trust, as somebody has said that already, that somebody isn't judging, and that people are able to find that their stories have more in common and are similar to each other than they ever thought in the first place. And I suppose what we've seen is the healing that comes out of that for people. There's not enough of it going on. There's not enough of a collective sense of it going on, but it's happening in unexpected spaces, in many different places, some of which probably many of you that are attending this event here this evening, you know, are familiar with within all of that. And the other thing is really the protection of politics and the protection of democracy. So what do we mean when we say, you know, democracy? You know, it's our ability to have trusted representatives that we trust, that will be able to maybe look at the issues that are in our communities, that will be able to collaborate, that will be able to see beyond sometimes, you know, the very narrow focus of whether it's North Kerry or whether it's somewhere else up on the border within that. And just 2 days ago, Glencree facilitated a dialogue on democracy, on ethical, sorry, it's getting late, ethical discussion and civility, you know. And there was a guy from Kansas University, the Joe Cox Foundation as well from the UK, and also and somebody from the European Commission. And common across all of those constituencies was a real worry about the polarization of politics, the fact that people are wrapped up in their own media bubbles and are not listening to anybody else. And, you know, and that is a concern for us, not just in the north of this island, but it is a concern for us this island, more broadly in the UK, our neighbours, and certainly in Europe, because as Katy said, what's happening at the moment, the edges in Poland and in the Ukraine and in Hungary, you know, that can start small, but it can mushroom. And then all it needs is, if there's enough uncertainty and fear, that it magnifies within all that. And the last thing I'll say is, if we want women in politics, and this will be a sad political institutions if we have no women in politics, this kind of personalized demonization of women that's happening on social media, not just in Ireland, but across this island and elsewhere, has got to stop. And we have to be in a position to be able to stand up and say that. And that is not that to say that I am promoting or leaving men out of the loops, but it has been proved here that, for example, women are voting and saying things, well, I'm not going to go for election because if I have to put up with people saying what they're saying about me in a personal basis, like, why would I want to put myself and my family through that? So you can say it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And I think we can't be silent on it because it's too important. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Barbara. And we're over to our final speaker now. Back to Geraldine. Thank you.
Wonderful insights that I endorse and feel inspired by. I'm aware that in the next few days, the Four Corners Festival gets started. For those of you who don't know about the Four Corners Festival, it's a civic initiative that was started 10 years ago. And it was started by a clergyman and of the Presbyterian tradition and the Roman Catholic tradition, Steve Stockman and Martin McGill, and with a lot of other rippling effect and bringing other people in to challenge us to and enable us to cross the city, to come out of our own corner, out of our own comfort zone, and engage in the culture, the art, the drama, the debate, the discussion, religious reflection, and to building out from what Chris Gibson initiated with a colleague way back at the time of the Civic Forum, that one small step. If we can all take one small step, make a beginning. So the Four Corners Festival will have all kinds of events. I've booked in for 4 of them, and including some readings and enactments from Sam Thompson's Over the Bridge, the Archbishop of Canterbury in St. Peter's Cathedral, and Austin Evera, I think bringing a message possibly from the Pope to St. Anne's Cathedral on Sunday night. There's a wonder walk opening the way between the Ballygomartin, Shankill and the Falls, the Upper Springfield, a new greenway, the Millennium Greenway. Again, it's just to endorse the connections that are still being made in fresh ways. And they, the 2 initiators, with their able band, including erstwhile colleague and present colleague of UKD, Gladys Gagnon, another one who's on that committee. Sorry, lost my train of thought by making that sidestep. So using connections, I think I'm putting out a challenge to any of you who don't live too far from Belfast to make the journey impossible, to go to something or tune in online. Because what you were saying earlier, Alan, about the boundaries, the flashpoints. I remember Leslie Carroll saying once that she was so frustrated by the fact that so much of her church life, so much of her civic engagement in North Belfast was driven by what was happening on the boundaries. And it almost nullified and set back by months work that had been painstakingly undertaken. I think the boundaries issue is something that needs not more focus on. I think the challenge to us is to, if we're to build relationships, we need to think not simply about crossing boundaries or getting the peace walls down, but looking at what is the quality of life and flourishing in the hinterland of the boundary, behind the boundary. Do we know about it? Do we have conversations? Do we go out of our way to actually learn about it? By accident, when I was looking up something this morning, trying to find, I couldn't remember the name of a Shankill Road artist back in the 40s, 50s, I think, that I encountered when I was bringing students from ISC on a tour of some of the significant places in Belfast. And we were crossing from the Springfield Road over to the Shankill Road. And we had the handover from Costa, representative, to the EPIC representative guide. And he said, the EPIC guide said to me, would you mind if we called into the Spectrum Centre because there's an art exhibition? He said, I know you're really interested in the murals. And I nearly fell on his neck and said, we would love to. I didn't even consult the students, but I knew that they would like that opportunity to get inside the culture, inside the cultural richness, and something that was to be kind of acknowledged and celebrated and learned about. So I felt moved to, and Alan, maybe you can find me his name. I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten it. But it was that idea of the boundaries being the places of fascination, which reinforces the fascination with violence and reinforces the powers that are actually holding the boundary in place, which actually distract from the needs and the cultural, the culture that's been kept thin and non-vital because of the violence that breaks out on the boundaries. So crossing boundaries, not for the sake of crossing boundaries, but to get inside the areas, the cultures, the opportunity to have good conversations, reflexive conversations, and not be afraid to put ourselves beyond question, allowing deliberative democracy and cultural exchange, and being able to listen to the why people see things so differently on that side of the pole, and trying to move into a space of empathy, compassion, and mutual interaction and engagement. How am I doing on time? No, out of time. Okay, grand. That's fine. That's
sorry.
No, that's fine.
But you asked, so I had to answer honestly. But thanks so much, Geraldine. You took us on a tour of so many great things there at the end, and with some practical suggestions of things we can actually do in the coming days. So that takes us to the end of our kind of formal program. We're going to have some questions then or now, and I still invite you to put them in the chat if you want to ask questions of the panel. And as Jin sort of works out what the good ones are, or what they're saying. I mean, I was really struck. I've taken a lot of notes during this, and I just feel I'm of this mess of sort of insightful commentary, incisive sort of diagnoses, but also so much sort of wise counsel and ideas as well. It's nice to share something where I'm sort of a fan of the panel, a fan of all of them and the organizations and the work that they do, and I've learned so much. I think there were two things I was thinking about during that. One was the kind of the scale of the peace process, or the sort of system of a peace process, where you've got everything from sort of the geopolitical stuff at the top, and then you've got the stuff happening at a very ground level, and you've got so many different groups involved, not just the orange and green, but young people and women and newcomers to Ireland and the poor and all these sectors. They have a stake in society, and so they have a role in peace building, and you know, that kind of system's changed over time. And then I was also thinking about the length of the peace process as well. You know, we think of peace processes as these kind of, you know, 5 or 10 years back in the 90s, and that was them. That's when they happened. But in fact, you know, we're now into a generation. We're starting to realize that these are generational long projects, a bit like the Irish Civil War, which got a mention. You know, a huge long process, and I don't think ordinary people or scholars have really quite grasped the whole idea of a peace process as a multi-generational project. I think as you get older as a person, you sort of realize that time is kind of shorter and quicker than you thought it was when you were young, because now I can sort of look back, and the peace process was in my youth, and I'm still sort of young, not really very young, but other people might look at it as a long period, but in fact, in some ways, it's not very long at all. So there's a lot much further to go, and it's sort of this endless thing we have to work on and talk about and understand. So Jin, do you want to choose, or do you want me to choose, or have you got, do you want to summarize or direct these, or do you want me to Have a go.
Thanks, David. So I have a great sort of comments and questions coming in to chat box. So I have 3 groupings for now, and then I have a couple of other questions are coming in, but then you can direct the questions to the panel members, David. At the same time, I can share some of the questions are coming in. And the first group of the questions are about education and what would be the implication for education. And the panel members talked quite a lot of the sort of the issues here, and then in your own views, and what would be the implication for education, in a sense that how to help young people to trust themselves, and also how could young people, I mean, to deal with their parent generations and conflict when they don't want to live in that conflict anymore, and particularly out of the cross-community sort of educational activities. And then the second grouping would be about in terms of the attitude of people. So should the Irish from South or from the North to reach out to unionists more or not? And then would it be a good idea for us to sort of think about that? And in terms of the possibility of Celtic association with Scotland, and is that a possibility, or is it a creative thought? And then finally, in terms of the messaging, and where is the balance between the positive messaging and also the healing of for remembering, and then the collective lamenting? Would there be a balance? So there are 3 sort of sets of questions. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Jane. Does anybody want to speak about education? Education didn't really come up too much, but I mean, Alan, you're maybe the closest to young people. Do you want to say anything about their experiences in school, or where your young people are coming from, and how that contrasts with what you experienced?
Yeah, I think it's 2 seconds. Yeah, it's no hidden secret that, especially in North Belfast and more so across the PUL communities, Protestant Unionist Lawyers communities, that young males in particular are underachieving when it comes to education. But as a whole, I think one of the bits of feedback from our young people when we do our international programs, especially when we go to the likes of South Africa, young people there recognise how young people value education, how school is seen as you know, something that's amazing, something that's you know, I'm hard to put it into words for it. But what our young people are turning around and saying is that they don't value education as much as they probably should, because it's seen as a sort of, it's there and you just avail of it. So that's at the lower end of it. At the higher end of it, we're seeing a claim, especially with young females across Belfast, achieving and doing very, very well. Our numbers in terms of our own project here at the moment, I spoke of, the amount of young people going into higher education has been phenomenal, and I think that's not one fact that other young people, aspiring young people, but still we face the issue within, you know, inter communities like the Shankill, North Falls, stuff like that, where males in particular aren't achieving. I don't know if that answers the question or not. Yeah,
I mean, the question was about integrated education, but I think what you're saying is that almost what you see is the problem of aspiration, of class and selection, and where people can actually get to. So I don't know if integrated is something you think about, or...
Yeah, in terms of the integrated education, there was 2 police officers actually wrapped the door there as I was just about to speak. I went, push on. But in terms of integrated education, unfortunately, I love the concept of it. Obviously, I'm 100% behind the integrated education. But unfortunately, in areas like here in North Belfast, and it's very, young people are brought up that their brothers and sisters went to a certain school, and that's the school that they want to achieve, to go to. And integrated education, unfortunately, is always usually a second choice to many young people and families growing up in these areas. It's sort of, I didn't get my first choice of getting into the boys' model or the girls' model school, but I could go to Hazelwood. And I don't think they've really thought, you know, there's no real thought process getting until, you know, bringing two religions together in a school setting. And as I talk about, relationships would be powerful and it would be move on. Unfortunately, it's not seen like that. We're still very territorial in this side of the world. We're sort of, you know, I live in Greater North Belfast or Greater Shankill. I'm going to go to school there. I'm going to live there. I'm going to get a job there, and I'm going to buy my house there. Still very that much mentality. I don't know, hopefully that answers will be a bit more of that.
Thanks. Yeah, Geraldine.
I'd like Salters maybe to say something about a little project that actually took to doing something about that in terms of involvement with parents in one instance with Sandy Row and the schools in that neighbourhood, and then more recently in East Belfast, though it's been partly halted by COVID. But just this morning I was looking up something on education, and I found another example of cooperation across the old divide. Stranmillis College, University College of Education, and St Mary's College of Education just last year produced a research report on educational aspirations and disadvantage and attitudes to education in the loyalist, these acronyms PUL, and we know what we mean. There's such differentiation between underneath those stupid acronyms, but there was they find it's a short report, just 44 pages long, but it brought out exactly what you're saying, Alan, in terms of lack of aspiration. Tackled all that, but it also gave a theoretical framework in terms of the fact that, which again reinforces what you're saying, schools, the way they're constituted, are not actually meeting the needs of children from areas that are characterized by a loss of a tradition of interest in education and going to third level education. So your point made earlier about partnerships with universities, I think Salter Sterling could say something about that as well, because he's done it in Dublin. But there was an interesting contrast also drawn when they looked at former combatants, representatives from those sectors, and how education was viewed very differently. It was a small sample, but among the unionist loyalist community, there wasn't the same store set by it, and they gave the usual reasons that they were pretty sure of a job, or the attraction of doing something to protect their people was stronger. Whereas in some of the former Republican former combatants, they talked about, which illustrated the idea of education that could be a way of resistance and a way of overcoming lack of agency, and that Longkesh became, like Mandela in his cave, place of study. So too, it became a place of breaking out of poverty, breaking out of disadvantage, breaking out of loss of agency. And I have in my hand here Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. It's really a false cover, a book that was smuggled into Longkesh, into the Republican prisoners, and it's really Liam O'Flaherty's O'Malley's The Singing Flame. Kate Turner will be interested in this insofar as it's an everyday object transformed by the Troubles. I've taken it into custody. There's someone who is going to donate it to the Healing Through Remembering Everyday Objects Transformed by the Troubles exhibition. But just two views of education, and I think Salter Sterling might have some comment on that as to how universities can help.
Okay, thanks. We're gonna stick to the questions. I don't know if Salters can get into the chat perhaps, but I want to get through the stuff on the right hand side. There's a sort of direct, sort of almost technical question about Brexit, which I'll have to direct to Katy, of course. The extension of the Northern Ireland Protocol to Scotland and the creation of a Celtic association similar to the Benelux. Is that something that's out there or possible, or what do you think of that?
Oh, it's a great question, and Jay Morris has done brilliant work in imaginative thinking, creative thinking around the situation in which we find ourselves now post-Brexit. And I won't get into the question of extending the protocol because that becomes very technical. But obviously the relationships between the four parts of the UK are, as I mentioned, transformed by Brexit. And I think that's going to have huge implications, not just for the more, for the headline grabbing issues around rising support for Scottish independence and those kind of things, but more fundamentally on a almost day-to-day basis, there's going to be adjustments in the relationships that then will begin to be felt by wider society and most particularly business. So it's an interesting time, and the UK government is aware of the changing dynamics of the union, and I see there's been a recent announcement for a Council of the Nations, so-called. However, I do think, and that's probably rather tokenistic, Boris Johnson to bring the Welsh and Northern Ireland and Scottish First Ministers together, etc. But I do think it goes back to the point of, well, what do we already have and how to make that work better? And we know that Tane Town has written a lot on this from the ISC, but basically there's a lot of things that we have through the Good Friday Agreement that we let lapse and certainly didn't make the most of, the British Irish Council being one such thing, perhaps the North-South Ministerial Council being another. And there's lots of opportunities now, I think, because the challenges are so great, as I mentioned before, to have a proper look at the scope and capacity of these bodies, not just for shared identification of shared problems, possible means by which they can be addressed together, but about building those, maintaining those, and building on those relationships that exist, because it is going to be more difficult for that to happen, not just at the political level, but for civil servants as well. And that relationship between officials and the familiarity between them is really, really important, I think.
Super, thanks, Katy. I want to ask Barbara a question from the chat and then come to Alex just after that on symbolism. Barbara, there's a question about, I suppose, Irish outreach to Unionists or Southerners to Northerners or whatever we want to call that. I just wonder from your perspective at Glencree, how do you see that, especially in the context of all this talk about a new Ireland? Do you think do we know each other well enough in the North and the South, or do we need to get to know each other better?
No.
And how do we do that?
No, we don't know each other well enough, and sometimes we don't know each other at all, and we work out of the worst stereotypes in many different phases. And I suppose just to answer the just about Glencree and about the outreach unionists, that is like a core part of the importance of the work there, to enable a lot of the time maybe back channel conversations between different people that unionists would like to speak to, or that would like more information about different elements of different things. So it would be really a core part of the organization and a core focus on that. And that as well, I suppose, for Glencree, it would, the building of those relationships, the keeping of those relationships, the maintaining of those relationships, and then in some way to be a kind of a facilitator, an impartial facilitator that will enable people maybe to get to kind of get that information. And also, since Northern Ireland isn't part of the European Union anymore, that that those connections are really important, so that unionists and others, of course, political people in the North as well too, are not cut off from the relationships on Europe. So yeah, so it's really a very important part of what we do. We don't talk, but we do a lot of it.
Thanks so much. And I think, looking at the clock, this might be our final question, and I'm going to direct it to Alex, because there's a question in the chat about, I think what you were sort of talking about messages of hope and symbolism and so on. And the question is, what's the balance between collective lament and the power of positive active messaging? You know, I think this is a big problem. How do we look at the past, memorialize the past, mark the past in a way that's future positive, or do you know what I mean?
No, of course.
It's a difficult thing to tread between respecting the past and getting into the future. So I wonder how we do that. That's a big question.
Well, I don't know if I have the answer. I think we're all aware of just how important this messaging is, particularly in the social media climate, and to engage with people in a way that analog folks like myself, don't exactly know how to do that. But it does seem that future focused, I mean, we've had a year, I have a centenary now. Well, what does the next 100 years look like? And can that be a way of overcoming the divisions that we obviously have and need to respect, but think, how do we actually build a shared future together? And what does that look like? How do we share our stories with one another so that we can have a shared story going forward? But it also speaks to me, this idea of messaging and audience and trust. Makes me think again about how you actually build that trust across all levels of society, because I think that there are kind of two different ways of thinking about it. One, and in terms of personalities and how you might present this to the wider public. I'd love to kind of gather a Justice League of trust with trustworthy representatives, knowing that trust is long and hard to earn and quick and easy to lose, and will not pass the smell test if people do not trust you. But there are those that folks trust because they know what they are, they know what they stand for. People we all sort of recognize, kind of the Mary McAleese figures or the George Mitchell figures. I think maybe the most trustworthy person in Ireland right now might be Patrick Keelty. You may not know everything that they stand for, but you know what you're getting into when you bring those people in. They're a trusted entity. But what is perhaps most important, I think, for going forward is that we raise up the folks from the grassroots who not everybody may know. They may not be as well known as those celebrity types, but everybody who does know them trusts them. And Geraldine has already mentioned, Martin McGill, Steve Stockman. There are other people. And I don't want to name folks out, but the folks with the real street cred that some of us know about that could be elevated. I know that at Corrymeela, one of the things that's really clear is that those folks who have now passed, folks like Maura Kiley, Mervyn Love, it's after they've gone that you realize just what gravity they had in terms of bringing people towards them, that sense of almost a celestial body that could have an orbit around them. I think we need to figure out how to message and move around those clusters of people and get them to be how we build and re-stitch together, to mix my metaphors, that community of trust build out. That would be my thoughts on that, being thrown in at the deep end here. Thank you.
Thanks for tackling that, Alex. So we're near the end now. I'm going to pass over to Jin, who I think wants to say something.
So the next webinar will be in March, 31st of March at 5 p.m. As usual. The title is The Ecumenical Movement and Just Peace on the Island of Ireland, Christianity Discredited or Pilgrim's Progress, which will be chaired by Andrew Pierce. We are in the process of confirming the panel members. So the details will be available in February. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you, Jin, for organising this, because it's been brilliant and we've all enjoyed it. And hopefully I'm speaking for everyone in the little boxes up at the top as well. So thanks very much to the speakers. You've taken us across an amazing sort of landscape of insights and ideas and a lot to think about going forward. And I think it just shows the importance of these kind of conversations and people from different sort of sectors getting in on these conversations as well, because it really enriches all of us, I think. And hello and thanks to everyone out there for coming. And hopefully we'll see you maybe at the next ISE webinar or somewhere in person even. That would be amazing, ideally. But if not, on the webinar. And that's it. Thanks very much.